So in our last two videos, we discussed how the thoracic cage, with the help of muscles, can expand and contract to essentially work as a pump on the lungs to draw air into the lungs or help expel air from the lungs. However, we've left out some pretty important information in this process, in that in order for this cage to act as a pump on the lungs need to be in contact with the inside of this thoracic cage. So if the lungs were just floating within this thoracic space, this cage couldn't work as a pump on the lungs. And indeed, the lungs are in contact with this cage. However, it's not a completely adherent connection. It's a rather loose connection. And it's this connection that we're going to talk about in this video. So what I've done is I've drawn a cross-section through the thoracic cage so we can see both the rib cage and the lungs. So here's our cross-section through the cage. And these here are ribs. So here are our ribs. And this is our lung. We're just looking at the right lung. And the lung is in contact with the inside of the thoracic cage. However, it needs some help, and it uses this pleura for help. So what is the pleura? The pleura is a really thin membrane that lines the lungs as well as the rest of the thoracic cavity. So you have pleura here in blue lining the lungs, as well as pleura here in green lining the inside of the thoracic cage, as well as lining the diaphragm. So this is the diaphragm. So this is kind of strange, right? You have these two pleural layers separated by this small space. How on earth did that happen? Well, the pleura is pretty interesting in that during development, the lungs grow into this pleural sac. So at one point in time, during development of the embryo, the pleura was just a complete sac, and the lungs push into this sac. And so this organization between the lungs and the pleura is thought to be similar to sort of pushing your fist into a balloon. Okay? So if you push your fist into the balloon, you have some part of the balloon that's in contact with your fist, and then you have some part of the balloon that's not in contact with your fist. Now, depending on the part of the pleura that we're talking about, it's given a specific name. So the pleura that's attached to the lung itself, which is here in blue, is called the visceral pleura. Right? So if we're looking at our fist in the balloon, this blue layer is visceral pleura. And the part of the pleura that's in contact with the rib cage or in contact with the diaphragm here in green is given a different name, and this is called parietal pleura. Parietal pleura. And if we're looking at our balloon, it's the part not in contact with our fist. Now, this pleura is really important for the function of the lungs. It's really important in respiration. And it's thought to have two critical functions. So, function of the pleura. First function is to reduce friction. So these lungs are constantly expanding into this thoracic cavity and rubbing up against the inside of the thoracic cage. And you could imagine that over time there'd be some amount of friction that's developed between the lungs and the inside of the cage. However, the pleura secretes a fluid, secretes a serous fluid, that lubricates these two surfaces and prevents any friction from developing. Okay? So this visceral pleural layer is constantly rubbing up against this parietal pleural layer, but because of this serous fluid, you get reduced friction. Now, the other main function of this pleura is to hold the lungs open. Hold the lungs open. And how does it do this? Well, this serous fluid has an additional function in that it creates some amount of surface tension between these two pleural layers. Okay, so this is similar surface tension to if you put a thin layer of water between two glass plates. It'd be difficult to remove those two glass plates from each other, and that's the same sort of thing. So the serous fluid is holding these two pleural layers in close contact. So there really isn't much space between these two pleural layers. This fist in the balloon isn't completely correct, this analogy. Now, this surface tension holds the lungs open and prevents the lungs from collapsing, because you can remember from our last lecture that the lungs have a lot of elastic tissue within them, and they want to spontaneously collapse, and this serous fluid prevents that from happening. Now, the pleura has an additional trick up its sleeve to preventing collapse of the lungs, and that's because within this space there's less air, so there's negative pressure. Negative pressure. So there's essentially a vacuum within this space that's holding these two pleural layers in contact and preventing the lungs from collapsing. So now we're going to do a little experiment, little thought experiment, to test the function of this pleura. We'll do this experiment on me. I'm going to give consent for this experiment. And what we're going to do is poke a hole in my chest cavity. So here's our knife. I'm going to stab me in the chest, and this is going to hurt a lot, and I'm going to bleed. Now, aside from all the pain, something else can happen. So if we only poke a little hole in this parietal pleural layer, what can happen, because originally there was less air and negative pressure within the space, air can suddenly fill this pleural space. And when air rushes into this space, it can break this surface tension that the serous fluid is providing between these two pleural layers. And this may, unfortunately, cause my lungs to collapse, okay, if this surface tension is broken. Now, this can be fixed. A surgeon can fix this by sticking a tube into this space and sucking the air out, and this allows the lungs to reinflate. And this happens during injuries to the thoracic cage, during chest wounds, and it can happen spontaneously. And when this happens, it's called a pneumothorax. Pneumothorax, which essentially means air in the thoracic cavity. So this pleura is really important for keeping the lungs open. It allows the lungs to move without friction within this thoracic cavity, and it keeps the lungs in contact with this thoracic cage, allowing this cage to work as a pump on the lungs. So that's it for our video mini-series on the mechanics of respiration. If you haven't already done so, why don't you go and watch the Khan Academy videos on respiration, which should fill some gaps that I didn't have time for in these videos. Thanks for watching.